So those are kind of the operators that we have in the SQL world. That's basically the extent of it. There's a between operator as well, but those are the main ones that we kind of need to understand. Okay? So when we're translating over to the world of Mongo, Mongo kind of has some operators as well, has a set of operators that you can use for comparisons or queries. These often go into your match document or your filter document. It's called different things depending on where you're at. But they're kind of the same idea. They're operators to compare two things. So if we're looking at MongoDB, your query operators, it's the same kind of idea, but there are a few additional query operators, specifically because things like arrays are allowed, arrays and nested objects. So they all start with the $sign, right? So the first one you probably ran into is this simplest one. $EQ just means equals, right? Is this value here is equal to something else. Oftentimes, this operator is optional, whether you're running on the shell or running it through your code. I would recommend using this over directly specifying it because it does avoid some code injection attempts. If you don't specify this, there are some ways for a hacker potentially could get in and modify your query. Does that make sense? Because they can inject a document instead of what you had said. So, for instance, if I'm looking for people that have customers that have the first name John, I could write it this way. I could say first name is John, right? But the problem is this part here is supplied by the user. Does that make sense? This part is potentially dangerous because the user is typing this first part in. So if they want to be sneaky, what they do is send you a JSON object instead, and they say, okay, well, I want all of the names So rather than getting everybody with the first name John, they're sending you this thing here. NEQ stands for not equal, and they'll get all the customers that are not John. And they can put whatever operator they want in it. They could say, hey, give me all the ones after John, greater than or less than, and they could run this a few times and potentially maybe get your entire user base. See the problem? Or make things run really slow because you were expecting to get one document back, and that may be a very large portion of your customer base. You know, if you have a million customers, that could well be close to 1 million records that come back. Obviously less because there's multiple Johns. Make sense? So it is kind of a security mechanism to include that, because what happens if you put the EQ in there and they try to do the same thing, so the way I want to write this instead in terms of security is I'm going to write $EQ That's how I want it to look. I say the first name is equal to John rather than just saying first name John. Because then if they attack this, we take that document, put it in here, and we get an invalid statement because it says equal, not equal. I can't do that, right? So that would make this invalid. It wouldn't run the query, it would just throw an exception. Make sense? So from a security standpoint, that using that equal operator is pretty important. You've seen a few of the other ones in there. GT, what does GT stand for? Greater than. So this is your poop. If you're seeing GTE, what were we talking about? So yeah, so that's what we're talking about there, and so you got some quick operators there. Same way you have less than LT, and you have LTE for less than or equal to. So those are kind of your basic operators. There's a few more in there. One of the most useful operators that I use literally all the time is this little in operator, $in. $in is amazing. And we get that partly because of the support for arrays. $in is really, really pretty powerful. In fact, I think the documentation on it really does not do it justice, because it actually does a lot more than what it says on the box. So $in can actually be used in a few different ways that I might call to your attention. So I can use it, let's say I want to do this. Let's say I'm looking at blog articles, and every blog article has an array of tags. And so I could say the tags, curly brace, $in, and I could say this one has maybe ones that are tagged with Java. Okay. So that would bring back any records, any of those blog articles that have a tag of Java. Make sense? Kind of similar to the like in some ways, but it's actually looking through an array. So we're saying that tags is an array. That's what this works with, and we're saying, hey, I want it to be this thing. Good so far, right? That's the main use of int. Is you're saying, I want to find a value that's in an array in the database somewhere. Okay? A nested array. You can actually get a little bit more fancy with this. So let's say I want ones that are tagged with two different tags. So I want to say, hey, we want ones that are tagged with Java and security. So I can actually put a little array in there. Okay. So this would say, hey, I'm looking for Java security. Turns out it's an OR. This is give me any blog articles that have the tag Java or the tag of security. It's not both, but it's one or the other. Make sense? So I can get a bunch of things that have this anywhere in there, which is kind of interesting because I'm saying, okay, well, the tags on the articles is an array, but I'm also giving an array here, right? So I'm using an array to do search, and I'm also looking inside of an array within the document. So there's a lot of more, it's a little bit more sophisticated than what it looks like on the cover. Okay. Another operator though that's worth mentioning there is sometimes you want to do, okay, so let's see, element evaluation array. Sometimes you get into the case where you want to say, hey, I actually want it to meet both of those things. So if I want it to be both Java and security, I want to have both of those tags. I just use the all operator and set. So in says, hey, I need to match at least one of these things. All says it needs to match everything that I specified. Cool. So it may have other tags, like it could be Java security performance in C++, and you could have all 4 of those tags and it would still match that. But if I use the all operator, I'm saying it has to match both of those, not just one of them. So that's a pretty easy change in there. Also, things I can do. Trying to think if there's. It's worth noting that if tags is also just a single string instead of an array of strings, this does actually match if that string is Java or security. It doesn't necessarily have to be an array for this to match. Cool. So it could be that you're providing, it could be that there's an array in the database. It could be that there's an array here that you're using, or both. Any of those 3 cases are handled by that in operator. So that in operator is really, really helpful. Cool. And I think you do need that for some of the exercises. Like, I think I told you to find ones where, you know, they're in this genre or such and such and things, and that's the operator you need to do those kind of things. There's also in there, if you look immediately next to the N operator, you're going to see that there is a NIN operator. So NIN would be for not in. So that's where we're saying things like, hey, I want blog articles that don't contain the tag of Java or don't contain the tag of security. So that would be the opposite. So you can use all 3 of those. Those are kind of the 3 to fit together. In, all, and not in. You also may notice that there's some sort of logical operators. There's an or, there's a not, there's an and. These are helpful. They do come up sometimes. They're a little bit more confusing, can be, because they do rely on some nesting. So for instance, if we're dealing with the or operator, then I'm saying, hey, here's some conditions that need to be supplied. So or takes an array, and this is conditions A and conditions B. That's how we would write our or. So I would say it's either A or B. And both of these are filter documents, match documents. So I can use all the operators and things that we talked about. But it's like, hey, these documents need to meet these conditions or match those conditions. Is kind of how that's what's going to go. And that's kind of all, that's the main ones I wanted to mark. Geospatial, there is at least 1 or 2 in there that are going to ask you to use the geospatial a little bit. Geospatial gives you, like, where is it on the globe? Far away is it? So this near operator you can actually use to say, hey, I want all the things that are within, say, 100 miles or 50 miles or whatever. So that's built in. You just need to work with the geospatial operators to do those kind of queries. Questions? You can see there's a lot of operators there available. You know, it's definitely one thing where you really want to, you know, read up through those as we're doing projects and different things. I will say that you're not going to use all the operators. There's a lot more operators in there than we will use this semester. But the basic ones you want to get familiar with, especially in. Like in and all are tremendously useful for a lot of things. Okay. Let's talk briefly about the. Yep. Yes.
So what about if it's not really like an object that has, I know like in the Inflix there's a couple objects that have multiple.
Yeah. So if you're dealing with nested checks, I'll erase this and kind of talk about it. So when you're dealing with nested data, if you kind of look through the documentation, you'll find this. I don't know that it's necessarily written down one place. In fact, that's an answer that I've basically found on Stack Overflow in terms of when I was learning this myself. So when we're dealing with nested data, let's give kind of an example. So let's say we're dealing with a course. So maybe that has an ID, 1, 2, 3, and we have the teacher that goes with. And so the teacher would be an object in and of itself. Let's down a little bit. So teacher, and so we have an underscore ID and 6. And maybe we give the course some, so we give this a name here. Name is AWD1. And we give it some tags, so it's nice and searchable. And so here we maybe have JS for JavaScript, Node, database, so you can kind of envision a simplified version of the course. Make sense? So it has a nested teacher object, and it also has a nested array of tags. Cool? Okay. So if I want to refer to nested documents in here, nested objects, the way I'm going to specify those filters, I need to use a slightly different syntax. So let's say I want to get all of the courses that have a teacher with the last name of Smith. So what I would need to do, if I have it set up this way, I would set my filter up as teacher, right? And to specify that I'm going down deeper, I need to do a dot family name. Okay, so dot is how you go down a level. Make sense? There's actually more than one way to do this, but this is usually the way you want to do it. Now, there's a gotcha in that this has to be a valid JSON or JavaScript name. Those names are not allowed to have periods in there. So this is not a valid identifier name. Your identifiers can only contain letters and numbers and underscores, right? Remember that from JavaScript. So this dot is not a valid character. So what we do is we just put it in quotes, and that makes it a valid thing. So if I want to say teacher.family name, I just need to put that in quotes, and I can say then that is equal to Smith. So if I want to find all the courses which a teacher with the last name Smith, that's how I would do that.
So then, say you wanted to find where the family name is Smith and the given name was Paul, would you just then do a teacher dot, like add on the end a teacher dot, given name?
Yep.
All the same thing. Okay.
Yep, same kind of idea. I would say teacher dot given name dot equal, and that would be So that would be any course that has a teacher with that person's last name. So I'm kind of dealing with nested data. Okay? Now, let's talk about tags real quick, and then I need to come back and talk about students real quick. So tags, as I said, most of the times, we kind of went over this in operator. Most of the times, it doesn't matter what order your array is in, and you should pretend that order is not predictable. Okay, most of the times, you should pretend that the order of the array doesn't matter. You've got nested arrays, and you want to make that assumption. Okay? Okay. So if you use the in operator, it doesn't matter what order the array is in. It will find, let's say I want to find all the courses with database. It doesn't matter if it's the first item, the last item, or anywhere in the middle. Okay. Sometimes, however, you do care about position. Sometimes, however, you do want to look at, hey, what's the first item? What's the second item? Etc. Okay. So it is possible to do that. In fact, the most useful scenario for that is checking that an array has at least one thing. So specifically, I can do this. I can say, can everybody see down here if I write down here? So I could say that tags colon, actually I want to do tags.0. This is what I'm doing for. So tag 0 would be the first element of the tags array. Okay? So I could say something like this. I can say $exists 1. So the exists operator just says it has to be there in the database. This would only find courses that have at least one tag. It will only be courses that have at least one tag. Does that make sense? So sometimes you do need to specify. You'll notice here I'm kind of using this dot notation. The square bracket notation like this you're used to, that is not supported. This here doesn't work in Mongo. You can't write out array indexes that way. So it's the dot with the index. Cool. So that's one gotcha. Okay. So let's say I wanted to specifically say, hey, I want courses that, rather than just saying it's in there anywhere, I might want to say, well, the first tag is JavaScript. That would say that exactly the first tag is JavaScript. Not any of the tags, but the first tag must be JavaScript. Cool? In general, that's not something you want to do, but you can do. Everybody tracking with me there? Sometimes you do need to refer to array indexes, but it's usually something you want to avoid if you can. Okay. You'll also notice that the array indexes as this, they're zero-based. So the first index is 0, second index is 1, etc., as you would expect with arrays. Okay. All right. I'm going to erase this so I have some more space. So picture, there's two more complex scenarios that we run into, which are kind of a combination of these things. So picture, let's say, how we have a course with multiple teachers, right? Well, then teachers is not just an object, it's an array of objects, right? Or more commonly, we might have an array of students, right? So I'm going to have a students property in here. Within that, I'm going to have an array of objects, okay? That gets a little bit more confusing. It can, because of the nature of it. Because I have, hey, here's a property name, and then I'm going to have an array index, and then I'm going to have the name of the property within there. So here, to get down to the given name, it was teacher.givenname or teacher.family name, right? If I'm going to get into a student's name, it would be like students.0.firstname or students.1.givenname, kind of that kind of thing, right? So I'm digging down another step. Is everybody tracking with me there? Okay. So for specifically, if I wanted to say, give me all the ones where the first student has a last name of Smith, then I'd be looking at students.0.family name dot equals Smith. Right? So that would give me any course where the first student has a last name Smith. Tracking with me? Or I could kind of do the same thing with teachers. I could say teachers.0.family. Okay. So that helps a little bit. Does that answer what you're talking about, Cody? Mm-hmm. So like if you're digging deeper, it's generally going to be a dot to go down, whether it's a name of the property or if it's a name like the index within it. Now, is there a problem with this? Is this what we want?
To avoid indexes and everything.
Yeah, I do want to avoid indexes. And specifically here, right, why is that index a problem?
It's only looking at the first position in the array.
Right, it's only looking at the first position. Right. In reality, usually I'm not looking for the family name. I'm probably looking for the ID, where I really want one like, hey, I know the student ID, and I might say, it's usually going to look a little bit more like that, where I'm saying, hey, I know the ID of the student, and I'm looking for what are the courses that that student's part of, right? But it's the same idea, right? The same idea. If you're looking for them with the last name Smith or the ID 123, the syntax is the same, okay? Whether it's a string or a number or an object ID, the basic syntax is the same ID, okay? So, how do I solve this? How do I find courses where that student 123 is part of it?
We should probably nest a query within the in for the array.
Okay, so that's a good question, right? So you're saying, hey, maybe I can nest it. So maybe instead of writing that, maybe I write students okay, and you're saying, let's use the in operator. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if I say in 1, 2, 3, does that work?
That can give us any instance of 1, 2, 3 in any part of the array.
Okay, so there's two different ways to architect this. Okay. One way, that works, and the other way, this gives us absolutely 0 results. Okay? Depending on how your data is structured, this will give you the results you want or nothing at all. Okay? You're kind of tracking with me there? So, if my array looks like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., this works. If my array is just an array of IDs, this is fine. It says 1, 2, 3 is in that list, or not in that list. Tracking with me? If you have an array of IDs, this is fine. It will work. But if you have an array of objects, which is really what we want, then we're looking at something like this. This in operator will give you absolutely 0 results if your data looks like this, which is usually looks like this. Okay. It'll give you absolutely 0 results because 1, 2, 3 is not in this list. It's a property of an object that's in that list, but the actual number 1, 2, 3 is not in that list. Does that make sense? Okay. If it's down a level deeper, it's not the same as actually being there. Okay, because it doesn't know. Well, it's like, oh, there's an object here. Doesn't match. Okay. Any thoughts as how we can solve this?
Another query after the end.
Another query after the end. Turns out I can't put a query nested inside of end, unfortunately. Okay.
Students.id.
Students.id. Turns out if we do students.id in, it will be looking at students looking for a property on that named underscore ID, and then looking inside of that property named underscore ID. So it actually, that still means something different. Okay.
Can we try the all operator?
Still same problem, only works if the data is in the other way around. Okay. So this is a common stumbling block. Like, this is a really, really common stumbling block. Okay. Tripped me up the first time I was learning this stuff, because it turns out you actually need another operator. That's what you need. You need a different operator to make this work. So if you're looking at the operators, the query operators page, we're going to go down to, there's a section on arrays. So there are 3 specific operators that work only with arrays. So all is one of them, element match, and size. Size is if you're saying, what's the size of this array? Element match is the interesting one. Okay, so element match is a little bit more complicated than in to use and to learn, but it's the way you solve these kinds of problems. Okay, so the way this works, element match says, here are some conditions that I want you to run for every element in the array. Okay? The nice thing about element match is it does allow you to actually nest operators, which is what we need here. Okay? So the way that we write this would be like so. I would say students, and instead of using the in operator, I'm going to use the element match operator. That then takes an object, okay, which is where we specify what we're looking for, okay? So specifically within this array, I'm looking for something that has an ID of 1, 2, 3. So my filter that I put into there is going to look like this. Underscore ID equals 1, 2, 3. And I think I've closed all those out. So you say students, element match, here's my conditions for the documents, the subdocuments within that array. And I say, hey, I want something with an ID of 1, 2, 3.
And the element match on the outside of that will return the elements. Right?
Yeah. You'll end up, well, it's saying give me, this returns a true or false basically. Element match and in both give you a true or false. Say, does this document as a whole match these criteria or not? Actually, it turns out it's looking at the student's array and saying, does the student's array match this or not? And so this in the end determines, do we include this course in the results or do we not include this course in the results? Whether we find a student with ID 123, or if we find a student with ID 123, we're still including all of the students. So it doesn't give us just back student 123. It still gives us back all the students within there. It just says I only want those courses. Does that sort of make sense? Because this is just saying, do I want to keep the record or not? Do I want to keep the record as a whole? We later use projection, which is another kind of thing, another phase in this, to say what data do we want to show? What data do we want to show? Okay? So does that answer your question, Cody, Evan, that we had on that? And you're dealing with arrays, there's a few different ways that this can look. And so more than likely it's going to end up looking this way if you're dealing with the nested array. Okay? There are plenty of cases where the in operator works. There are plenty of cases where you can just say equal. But the more complicated versions involve this element match operator. Okay? Usually you want to use whichever one's the simplest one that will work for your cases. Okay? Questions? Just briefly looking at the other operators, which are the update operators. There's the update operators. Okay. So on the update operator space, there are a bunch of ones there. You definitely want to learn about them, kind of get familiar with them. Set, I will say, is just hands down most of the time the one you need. Set is just say, hey, I want to set this value to this. And so you use this with your update statements specifically. And that includes if you have a field that you add, if you have a field that you're declaring, you're actually going to use set if you need to add an increment. There's some other ones that are really useful here, like increment that comes up all the time. Let's say I want to do some sort of upvote mechanism, and you say you upvote the post. Well, increment is the ability to do that, or on a count, some sort of thing. So those are really helpful. But there are a lot of these operators will make more sense as we get further into developing the software. Okay. The query operators are the main ones you want to focus on for the moment. So I'm going to let you guys get back to working on the labs. Hopefully that's given you